Hey guys, it's Justine here from I Should Read That, and today I am bringing you my April wrap-up. So the month of April was a pretty good reading month for me. I read 10 books of varying lengths and varying genres. It felt like a really good month to kind of mix things up a little bit. I read some stuff that was a little bit too realistic for our current situation. Of course, we're reporting live from quarantine. I read some sci-fi, I read some books that were set in real-world locations, some that were set in fantastical locations, and it was a really good month for reading. I really enjoyed the books that I picked up this month. And as an added bonus, I actually completed my O.W.L.s, which I have never done before. I talked about this a little bit in my May TBR video, but I have never actually completed the O.W.L.s readathon. I've never finished all of my prompts. I usually give up like 2 weeks in, and I kind of did that, but somehow I managed to keep myself on track still. I don't know. So first time ever I have completed my O.W.L.s for a Hogwarts professor in Transfiguration. So I will, instead of going through everything that I read in order this month, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight all of the O.W.L.s books that I read and the prompt that they fulfilled, and then I'll talk about the other stuff that I read as well, because not everything that I read was for that readathon. So the first O.W.L.s prompt that I completed was for Arrhythmia, which was to read a book outside of your preferred genre, and I chose horror, so I picked the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. I read this early in the month and I really enjoyed it. I have like become a full-fledged Grady Hendrix fan, I think, and I don't really know what I expected going into this, having only read one of his books before reading this, but I ended up really enjoying it. Having read a few more of his books now, I feel like it had his kind of trademark sort of snark and humor, but it was also, it felt like a proper horror book, or at least in my experience, because I haven't read a lot of horror. But yeah, this is a book that is set in Charleston in the 1990s, and it features basically a group of housewives who are part of a true crime book club, and they realize that their new neighbor is possibly not quite what he appears. It's a really fantastic book. I really enjoyed it. I loved the characters. I really loved his take on vampires, and I loved the kind of the setting and sort of how social norms and social expectations for these women wormed their way into the book. So I ended up giving this, I believe, 4.5 out of 5 stars. I have written a review for this. It's on Goodreads, which has some of the content warnings that come with it. For example, like rape and some gore. If you don't like rats, this might not be a good one for you, but if you want something that is really fun and kind of an unusual setting with unconventional characters for the genre, I would definitely recommend this. The next O.W.L. is astronomy, and that is to read a book when it's dark out. So I read The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin pretty specifically at night. That wasn't really intentional, that's just when I had time to read it. And by the time I realized that it could complete that O.W.L., I was mostly finished with it, so I just stuck to the whole night reading thing. So this is a new book from her, and it is a start to a brand new trilogy. It is set in New York City, which I very much enjoyed, and it's super weird, but it was so fun. I really loved this, especially as an ex-New Yorker, but I don't think you have to have lived in the city or even really been to the city to enjoy this. So The City We Became kind of follows the concept that when a city has sort of been established for long enough and is kind of like become, it's almost like its own entity, its own character, it sort of is reborn and has a soul. And most cities have one. New York has 5 because they have each borough, which is basically like its own sort of mini city within New York. So we have Queens and Brooklyn and Staten Island and the Bronx and Manhattan. So at some point all of these sort of people awaken to this sort of strange power that they have, and they are people who are very specific to their borough, and they have to kind of end up coming together to fight this ancient evil that is trying to tear New York City apart. This book is so weird. And I really, really enjoyed that. It's such a unique and wonderful concept, which is exactly what you would expect from N.K. Jemisin at this point. She always comes up with these incredible concepts for her books, and she executes them so incredibly well. I loved the characters in this book. I especially loved the Bronx and Brooklyn. Every person has this sort of like spirit of their borough, and it's just wonderful to see. I absolutely loved it. I also wasn't really expecting this, but one of my favorite parts of this book is the fact that she talks about how you don't have to be a native New Yorker to really be part of the city. And there are a lot of very snobby people in New York. And as someone who moved there and lived there for a while, and as N.K. Jemisin herself moved there, she's not a native New Yorker, I really love that. I think that that's such a wonderful thing to highlight in a book about New York. So I don't want to say too much about this one, honestly, because I don't think I could. It's so weird, it's so unique, but it's fantastic. It's super fast-paced. I absolutely tore through this and I loved it. I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars. The next Owl's prompt was for Charms, and that was to read a book with a white cover. This was actually on my TBR. This is Exhalation by Ted Chiang. This is a collection of short fiction, so short stories and novellas, and some that are kind of in between. And there are 9 science fiction stories in here, and I didn't really know what to expect going in. I did know that he is very lauded by sort of literary types, people who don't necessarily read science fiction. I don't really know many sci-fi readers who have actually read this book yet, so I was kind of going in a little bit maybe with some hesitation, but I loved this. It was so, so wonderful. So there are 9 stories in here, again of varying lengths, and I liked everything in this collection, which is really unusual for me because I tend to usually be kind of up and down with collections. But now that I think of it, most of the collections I have read have been a kind of anthology of different authors. This is the first one where I've read just one single author. So I have the table of contents here. There are a couple that I particularly enjoyed. Exhalation, which is about he's kind of a member of an alien species that are basically robots. And in an attempt to sort of figure out how memory is stored in his species' brain, something that has never been figured out, with tons of theories, he basically dissects his own brain and discovers implications for the wider world and universe, which was great. Really thought-provoking. It's one of those ones where you kind of like finish it and you just stare at a wall for like 10 minutes and just contemplate the world. It was great. I also really enjoyed O.W.L.s, which is the story, if you've seen my reading the Hugo's video, I'm going to attempt to read all of the finalists in 4 different categories. O.W.L.s is nominated for Best Novelette, I think, and I really, really enjoyed that one. That's basically set in a sort of parallel world in which kind of God and religion are very, very real, provable things, provable through science. And it follows a woman who is, I think she's a anthropologist, and she makes some kind of new discoveries. That was really fantastic. What's funny is Anxiety is the Dizziness of Freedom, which is nominated for Best Hugo for the novella. I actually didn't really love. I loved a lot of the stuff that he talks about and sort of the things that he makes you ponder in that novella, but I didn't really love it very much. It's basically, they have found a way to communicate with yourself in a parallel universe and sort of the way that people are using and abusing that. It was an interesting concept and I loved what he talked about, but I didn't necessarily love that novella. I thought there were other better ones in this. So that was a really, really interesting reading experience, and I knocked 2 things off of my Hugo finalist list for that. So I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars. It was just an incredible reading experience. If you like short fiction, even if you don't, I don't like short fiction, but if you're interested in sci-fi, if you like short fiction, if you're just intrigued by this kind of style of sci-fi writing, I would definitely recommend this. Next is Defense Against the Dark Arts, and I'm fudging this one a little bit. I think it fits. Some people may not think that there's a strong enough connection to the sea or the coast, but I read Incendiary by Zoraia Cordova, which has scenes that are set on the coast. so I'm choosing to count it for this particular prompt. This is a new YA fantasy, the start of a new series that came out in April, and it is inspired by 15th century Spain, which is the real hook for me. That's what I was really, really interested in. And it follows a girl named Renata, who is a member of the rebel group, basically made up of magic users. And the kind of neighboring kingdom has come in and conquered the Moria and their people, and is trying to wipe them out, trying to wipe out anyone who can use magic. And there are, I think there's 4 or 5 specific sort of types of magic that can be used, and she of course is one of the people who has one of the rarest and most feared types of magic, which is basically she has the ability to rifle through people's memories and take them away and sort of have them locked in her own brain. The only problem is that she does not remember a good portion of her childhood where she actually lived in the palace and served the king who has been wiping out her people. So she has the opportunity to infiltrate the palace once again and try to bring down the government from the inside. It was fun. It was fine. It has a good ending. I really enjoyed the ending. It's not anything outstanding or particularly special in terms of kind of the world and the characters. I wanted so much more from the world building. I wanted so much more from the characters, especially Ren, who I think it's hard to have a character who doesn't remember her own childhood, because a lot of that will sort of inform her story and her backstory. So I didn't really get a good sense of who Ren was. But to be fair, I don't think Ren has a good sense of who Ren was. So I'm very curious to actually continue this series and see how she develops as a character later on. I think this is going to be one of those series where I can't really judge how I feel about it until I finish it. So that should be really interesting. I gave this 3.75 out of 5 stars, a very, very specific rating, but I couldn't quite settle on 3.5 and 4 stars. Didn't feel quite right. So 3.75 it is. For Muggle Studies, I had to read a contemporary set book, and again, I'm fudging this one because I'm saying contemporary set. It just said contemporary. This does have a contemporary setting, but it is a fantasy book. I'm making up the rules here. This is the Deck of Omens by Christine Lynn Herman. This is the sequel to The Devouring Grey, which I loved when I read last year. It was so fun. It completely took me by surprise. I was not expecting to love it as much as I did, and I was very excited to get my hands on the Deck of Omens. So this duology follows the descendants of the 4 founding families of this very small town called Four Paths in upstate New York. And the founders have these incredible magical abilities that have been passed down through the bloodline. So we have 5 characters, 2 of them are brother and sister, which is how we have 5 with 4 families, and they are sort of the ones who are helping protect the town from this thing called the Grey, which think like the Upside Down from Stranger Things, and the beast that lives within the Grey. So stuff happens in the first book, and we are dealing with the complications from all of the stuff that happened at the end of that book. But we also very much get a unique kind of separate plotline, which I really enjoyed. It wasn't just drawing out the kind of like the trauma and the betrayal and backstabbing and all of that. We carried on and we did something new, but she also has the characters kind of sorting out their feelings and all of that, which I really enjoyed. I love the atmosphere of this series. She does such a good job of really painting a picture of this kind of misty, tiny, mysterious town in New York, and the sort of strangeness of this magic, the way that the townspeople kind of revere and fear the founding families, but also can turn against them, as we see. And it's really interesting. It's a really fun YA fantasy series. It is set in the modern world, which is something that I really, really enjoy. It hasn't always worked for me in the past, but I'm finding I enjoy that more and more, and this is a great example of that. I was really surprised by the characters, because I felt, and you can see in my review of this book, the girls really outshone the boys in the first book. There are 3 girls and 2 boys. And Isaac, who is one of those boys, in the first book was just kind of a disaster, a human disaster. I didn't really like him. He was just angry, and I totally like got why and everything like that, but I just didn't find him interesting. But he was my favorite character in this one. He got so much complex sort of character development. We learned so much more about his past and how that ties into the town, and it was just great. I really loved him, which was a huge surprise for me. Otherwise, again, the girls kind of outshine the boys on this one. So I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. I think I gave the first one 4.5. I did enjoy that first one a little bit more, but this is a super, super satisfying conclusion. I can definitely see her writing like spin-off series and everything like that, but this is its own kind of 2-book series, and it is very satisfying if you're looking for a shorter YA series to pick up. The next prompt was potions, and that is to read a book under 150 pages. I read a book that was about 46 pages, and I'm so glad that I discovered this. I discovered this through Scribd. If you've seen my reading vlog from that particular point in the month, I like flipped over how much I love this. It was just something I randomly picked up. I'm so glad I did. I listened to the audiobook of A Dead Djinn in Cairo by P. D'Ely Clark. This is the first in a sort of, I wouldn't call it a series, but there's a second one which is also on this list. And they're kind of like companion novels, and they're all set in 1912 Cairo, but a kind of alternate version of Cairo in which many years, decades, centuries in the past, a kind of magician type accidentally tore the veil between worlds, and the djinn came through to our world. So people in Cairo live kind of in harmony-ish with the djinn and with spirits, and there are skyships and trams, and it's just a really cool world. If you like the kind of flavor of Cairo in the city of brass, then I think you should definitely pick this up. Plots are nothing alike, but that sort of atmosphere very similar, and I would definitely recommend it. A Dead Djinn in Cairo is basically a fantasy murder mystery. A djinn is murdered, and a female police officer, who is very quirky in her own right, is called in to investigate, and there are wider implications in the city. It's just great. It's really short, very short, but it's just wonderful. I am always amazed by authors who are able to pack that level of world building and detail into so few pages. I love this. I give this 4.5 out of 5 stars. It was so good. And the last O.W.L.s prompt, which completes my 7 that I needed for my Hogwarts professor, was Transfiguration, and that was to read a book with kind of shape-shifting in it. And this was also kind of an accident. I loved A Dead Djinn in Cairo so much that I went ahead and also listened to the audiobook for The Haunting of Tramcar 015 by P. D'Ely Clark, the second book kind of set in this alternate Cairo. And it is much longer. This is also one of my Hugo novellas that I had to read, so another one ticked off the list, and I loved it. It was so good. I was a little bit worried at first because while it does follow the police, it doesn't follow that same amazing character. Instead, we follow 2 other police officers who are both men. And I was a little bit disappointed at first, but then the story kind of continued and grew, and I ended up enjoying it just as much. So the title kind of explains it all. There is a tram car that is being haunted by a spirit or a djinn, and these 2 police officers have to figure out what happened and get rid of it. That's pretty much it. And it is wonderful. It goes into kind of the ministry for kind of controlling and investigating these paranormal matters. It goes into some of the more folklore of Cairo, and it's just great. It's brilliant. I love the characters. I love the dialogue. These novellas are just wonderful, and if you haven't picked them up yet, you really should. If you have Scribd, the audiobooks are both on Scribd. I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars as well. It was just great. So I have 3 books that I read that were not part of the O.W.L.s. The very first, also from Scribd, was Made Things by Adrian Tchaikovsky. This is a novella, and it's a fantasy novella by him. And I've said before, I love his sci-fi. His sci-fi is amazing. I absolutely adore his sci-fi. Children of Time, Children of Ruin, brilliant. I love his fantasy a little bit less, so I didn't know what to expect going into this, if I was gonna like it or not, but this is probably my favorite of his fantasy books that I've read so far. So this is kind of a another simple story. It's a heist. Basically, it's a heist. We have this character who is a puppeteer. She creates and carves these beautiful puppets, and she sort of stumbles upon these almost like living dolls, these living puppets made from various materials, and she sort of creates this sort of shaky alliance with them. She keeps their secret because they don't want to be discovered. They have moved into the city hoping to build more of them and increase their population, and she basically has a couple of them help her out pickpocketing and she ends up getting involved in a heist, and it's great. It's funny because don't think I would ever call any of his books sweet, because they're not, but I feel like there's something about this that feels very sweet, which is weird. A word I never thought that I would associate with his books, but that's okay. The audiobook is narrated by him, and he has a great voice. He does a really, really good job with it. I really enjoyed the characters. I really enjoyed kind of the world and the magic, and you know you're always going to get something really interesting with him, especially in terms of magic. So I don't want to say too much about this one because it is so very small, but I think that this would be a nice book to read. It's not going to be one that I have impacting my brain forever, but it was definitely worth the read. I haven't quite settled on a rating for this yet, but it'll probably be between 3.5 and 4 stars. So next up, I read Wanderers by Chuck Wendig, the great big chunky pandemic book that I decided to read in the middle of a pandemic. I'm really glad I did. I don't know why I chose now. I've had this since it came out in July last year. I've wanted to read it for ages. I picked a pandemic to read it. I have anxiety. That was not necessarily the best idea, especially because it is very hyper-realistic. I think that it depicts a very, very realistic sort of path of events that could happen in a similar situation, like a global pandemic. So basically, it's hard to boil this book down into a couple of sentences to summarize it, but essentially we have this almost like phenomenon of sleepwalkers in the US. So we start out with a girl named Shanna, who's one of the point of view characters, and one day her little sister, Vanessa or Nessie, just sort of sleepwalks out the door. She can't wake her up, she can't stop her because her body starts freaking out. So she just follows her. And then some more sleepwalkers join Nessie, and more and more and more arrive. And no one really knows what this whole sleepwalking thing is. It's very mysterious, it is very suspicious for a lot of people, and there's this sort of flock of people, and they're walking somewhere. No one can stop them, no one knows where they're going. So we have these shepherds, who are the people who care for the sleepwalkers. So Shanna is one of these people. They're usually the sort of friends or family of the people who have been affected with this sleepwalking thing. And they are going along doing their thing. The CDC shows up, the Center for Disease Control. They're trying to figure out what the hell is going on, what this thing is. And at the same time, we learn a little bit later that there's this kind of mysterious illness separate from the sleepwalkers that is cropping up. Yeah, I don't know if that really does it, but that's okay. So this is a book that is constantly compared to The Stand by Stephen King, which is a book I have read. And what's really interesting is, this is possibly a controversial opinion, so I apologize, but there is a reason that The Stand was about 400 pages shorter when it was originally published. There's so much garbage in that book. There's so much that just could have been cut. It's, in a lot of ways, very sloppy. I mean, we have a 20-page passage of a character riding a bike down a highway. It's a great story, but there's so much that could have been edited out of that book. Wanderers is so tightly edited, every single thing in this book is important. And that was really awesome. There's nothing that I hate more than a long book that doesn't need to be long. I love long books. I actually prefer long books, but if it doesn't need to be long, if there's a lot of garbage in there and it's not, well edited, it drives me absolutely crazy. So this was fantastic for that. Everything in this fed into the full story, fed into the plot and everything that happens by the end. I did have some issues with this. Me and my friend Amber from Books of Amber both read this at the same time, and I think we had very similar views on this. So there are a couple of, I think, more major things to point out. There is a character named Matthew. I believe his name is Matthew, and he's kind of a small town preacher. And you don't really know what his connection to the story is for a while, but you eventually find out, and it is important in all of that, as everything in this book is, but I didn't love his story. I didn't love a lot of stuff that was connected with his story. I get it, but it just didn't really work for me. There's also a villain in this book who is so ridiculous and over the top. He almost borders on mustache twirling, and I feel like he would have been a much more powerful and more frightening figure if he was a little bit more subtle. I think that that would have really worked. Also, this is a funny one. I don't really know how to explain myself with this, so please don't get mad at me. Please try to understand where I'm coming from. There are a lot of really cool women in this book. There are. Shanna's great. There is a character named, I believe, Sadie. There's a character named Marcy. These women are awesome. They don't really do shit. He creates all these amazing characters, all these brilliant women, so fucking cool. In their own right, in their own book, they would be like outstanding heroines. But they're so shoved to the side. And they ultimately, in my opinion, don't really live up to their full potential, which is so disappointing. There's something about the way that the women were treated in this that I just didn't love and kind of made me a little bit mad. And I feel like I can't really explain myself. So basically I settled on, this book is so goddamn heavy. I settled on I'm still thinking about it. And it is a book that has really stuck with me. I am thinking about this still. I read it about 3 weeks ago. Probably 3 to 3.5 out of 5 stars. I really wanted to love it. Really, really wanted to love it. I've been so excited to read it for so long, and I did like it. Some parts are absolutely brilliant. All of the stuff about how the US sort of reacts to the sleepwalkers and to pandemics and things that they don't understand is brilliant and so good. There's some other things that I didn't love. I am going to do a review of this book on Goodreads and on my blog, where I will put a more complete list of content warnings, but just as a heads up, there is a pretty graphic rape in this book. I think it's not as graphic as it could be, but it's definitely quite disturbing and upsetting and doesn't actually feel like it needed to be there at all. So just a heads up, that is something that is in this book. If you're planning on reading it, it wasn't something that I was expecting. Amber actually was ahead of me and warned me about it, so it wasn't completely out of left field, but I think that if I had read it without knowing, I would have been like, what the fuck is going on? So just a heads up. And the last book that I read this month was Goldilocks by Laura Lamb. This is a sci-fi thriller that just came out on the 30th of April, and I loved it. It was so good. It was everything that I wanted and more. I love a good sci-fi book. I love a good sci-fi thriller, but I really love a good feminist sci-fi book, and that is exactly what this is. So it is a very alarming look at the future, something that is very realistic, that could very well happen. Basically, this book takes place on Earth in a sort of not so distant future in which climate change has completely ravaged the planet. We maybe have about 30 years of being able to actually survive on Earth, and at the same time in the US in particular, women are sort of being edged out. Women's rights are under threat. Things like abortion are illegal. Women are being encouraged to leave the workforce through things like birth taxes and things like that. Very, very controlled society for women. So we follow a character named Naomi, and she is the adopted daughter of a woman named Valerie, who is a woman who doesn't necessarily fit in with the kind of status quo of the US. She is an insanely wealthy woman, sort of like an Elon Musk type, and she has always dreamed of going to space. She was in charge of building this particular spacecraft before NASA edged her out. And basically, Valerie's like, hey, want to steal that spaceship and go to Cavendish, which is this habitable planet about 10.5 light years away from Earth. And Naomi's like, yes, I do. So these 5 female astronauts basically grab a shuttle, shoot up, and steal the spaceship that is in orbit. And they're heading to Cavendish in order to start a new society, a better future for women and for humanity, because Earth is dying. So they're on the ship, and things kind of start to go slightly wrong as they always do. And Naomi begins to realize that perhaps someone on board is not telling the truth. And there's a lot of other things that go on as well that I'm not going to spoil for you. But this was fantastic. It was so good. It's really brilliantly paced. I thought that it was very, very well paced. It's a little bit slower at the beginning. It starts to ramp up and ramp up and ramp up, and then oh my god. And it's one of those books where you will just lose an evening just sitting there and reading it. I loved the characters. I loved the relationships between the characters, particularly with Naomi and Valerie, her adopted mother. The sort of relationships between mother and child and these other women. There are two women on board who are married. Everyone's kind of in this weird situation and thrown together, and the way that all of their relationships change and grow stronger was really interesting, and I loved that. You know, I love female relationships in my books, whether they are familial or, you know, platonic or romantic. I just love women interacting with women, so that was really excellent. I just thought that this was a really fantastic book. A really, really well-written, smart, high-concept sci-fi book. It was fantastic. It's exactly what I've been wanting from sci-fi for a while. I feel like the last thing that I read that was sort of on the same level was probably Do You Dream of Terra 2, which is one of my favorite books ever of all time. So I feel like that says a lot. I think Goldilocks is going to be a new favorite for me. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. It's just great. It's absolutely brilliant, and I would so highly recommend you pick it up now. That is it for my April wrap-up. Those are all the things that I read last month. It was a really good reading month. I finished my O.W.L.s. I read some really good stuff. I didn't really have anything that bombed this month. Pretty much everything that I read I at least liked, if I did not love. So yeah, I'm very pleased. I'm hoping to bring some of that energy into what's the next month? May! Oh my god, it's May. So in the comments below, I would love to know if you've read any of these books, if they're in your TBR, or what you read in the month of April. I post bookish content to this channel fairly frequently, so go ahead and hit subscribe, check back soon, and I will see you next time.